Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 1771 took off from Los Angeles International Airport at 3:31 p.m. on December 7, 1987. The flight was a daily route between LA and San Francisco. The short commuter flight was scheduled to land just an hour and 12 minutes after takeoff. On this day, however, the flight never made it to its destination. Instead of being guided into land at San Francisco International Airport, it was last seen by members of the public living approximately 175 miles north of LAX. These witnesses reported that the plane was speeding down like a dart that had been thrown at the ground. It sounded to them that the plane broke the sound barrier as it plummeted down out of the sky from its cruising altitude of 22,000 feet. At 4:16 p.m., Flight 1771 crashed into a remote hillside on a cattle ranch near Paso Robles, California. Several local residents who had seen the plane go down rushed to the scene, quickly followed by local police and members of the sheriff's office. They went there in hopes of finding and aiding survivors of the crash. When they arrived at the scene, however, they could not see any people at all, living or dead. Instead, all they were met with was the strong smell of jet fuel and a field covered in thousands of sheets of paper. All 43 people, 38 passengers and 5 crew members on board the plane were killed. The investigation would later find that the plane had in fact hit the ground going approximately 770 miles per hour, slightly faster than the speed of sound. It had been traveling so fast that all of the lightweight objects on board, like papers and insulation, had been blown back upon impact, but in the brief instant before the explosion caused by the impact. All of the heavy, more rigid parts of the plane were obliterated. All that was left of the plane was mostly small fragments, and the largest portion of human remains recovered from the scene was a hand. Investigators estimated that when the plane had impacted the ground, it experienced a deceleration with the force of 5,000 Gs, or 5,000 times the force of gravity. To put that in perspective, some elite fighter pilots can survive a sustained force of 9 Gs, and there are cases of plane crash survivors experiencing up to 100 Gs for a brief second at the moment of impact. The effects of a deceleration 50 times more powerful than that on a human body is almost impossible to imagine. The National Transportation Safety Board arrived at the scene to begin their investigation. However, they were not alone. Also on site to begin their own investigation was the FBI. Due to reports from the flight tower controller about what they had heard over the radio during their final communications with the pilots of Flight 1771, they had reason to believe that the crash was the result of criminal activity. Flight 1771 was flown by 43-year-old Captain Greg Lindemood and 48-year-old First Officer James Nunn. Just a few minutes before the plane had crashed, one of the pilots made a routine transmission to air traffic control to ask if there had been any reports of turbulence from other pilots. 2 seconds after the tower responded, a loud noise came from the cabin. A second came 2 seconds later. One of the pilots notified the tower that there had been gunfire on the plane. The tower controller tried to get the plane on the ground as quickly as possible, asking the pilots if they could make it to Monterey, the airport closest to their current position. The pilots did not answer. The controller did not hear from them again. We do have some idea of what was said next in the cockpit of the plane, however. The various recorders on board Flight 1771, like the rest of the plane, were badly damaged due to the extreme speed of the plane at the time it crashed into the hillside. In the flight data recorder, the only scrap of tape that survived was wrapped around the recording heads at the moment of impact. The titanium crash case surrounding the cockpit voice recorder was crushed by the force of the impact, but the tape itself was miraculously intact. On the tape, the door of the cockpit can be heard opening, and a female voice, believed to belong to flight attendant Debbie Neal, is heard. In dramatizations of this incident, Debbie tells the pilots that there is a problem, and one of them asks what the problem is. Then a gunshot is heard, and a male voice says, "I'm the problem," before 2 more gunshots are heard. This version of events is not contradicted by the tape from the CVR, but it is not fully confirmed by it either. The gunshots and the opening of the door are heard on the tape. However, much of the actual conversation is unintelligible. Analysts were only able to identify a few words, like the female voice saying "captain" and the gunman saying "problem." Some FBI reports speculate that the gunman may have just said, "I've got a problem," as he came into the cockpit. The sound of the cockpit door closing could be heard 15 seconds later, followed by a 6th gunshot from out in the cabin. Then, windscreen noise began increasing on the tape as the plane went into its dive and as its speed increased. It is unknown if the gunman pushed down on the controls to initiate the dive, or if the controls were pushed down when the bodies of the pilots fell over onto them. The plane crashed just over a minute after its pilots were shot, and less than 2 minutes after the first gunshots were fired. With the CVR confirming that there had been a gunman on board Flight 1771, the FBI officially began a criminal investigation. Once the fact that the crash had been caused by an armed hijacker had been established, identifying the gunman became one of the top priorities of the investigation. The other was finding the weapon. Ultimately, fulfilling one of these priorities expedited fulfilling the other. After an intensive search, the barrel of a Smith & Wesson Model 29 .44 caliber Magnum revolver was found near the center of the impact crater at the crash site. Nearby, investigators found the majority of the rest of the gun, with 6 spent cartridges in the cylinder. The weapon was large and durable, but even it broke apart during impact. The .44 cartridge was the most powerful one commercially available at the time. When the second part of the gun was found, a portion of a human finger was still in between the trigger and the trigger guard. This led to the gunman being quickly identified, as investigators were able to develop a fingerprint from this finger. The fingerprint belonged to 35-year-old David Burke, a recently fired ticketing agent for US Air, the company that had recently purchased Pacific Southwest Airlines. Burke was a native of the United Kingdom, born in Croydon to Jamaican parents, who moved the family to the United States when he was 6 years old. He was very close with his family, which included his 4 brothers and 1 sister. Burke grew up in Rochester, New York, and attended Madison High School. He was a chubby and quiet teenager who maintained A's and B's in school, but preferred spending his time fixing up his car. While still in high school, he fathered his first child, but he was still able to graduate and then enroll at the State University of New York at Binghamton. He eventually left that school to enroll in a technical school to prepare him for work in the airline industry. His education did not immediately help him get a job with an airline, so he went to work in a factory for a year. He finally began his career with US Air at the Rochester Airport in 1972. After working as a baggage handler for 4 years, he was promoted to a terminal agent. According to those who knew him, Burke was a determined young man in both positive and negative ways. He was very hardworking and focused on succeeding in his career, but was also willing to take great risks for the sake of bringing in extra money. While his airline salary was modest, he had a very comfortable lifestyle and seemed to always have a large amount of cash on him. He treated $100 bills like pennies, according to one friend. He would give money to neighbors in need and buy rounds of drinks for the other patrons of the bars he frequently socialized at. He owned several properties around Rochester and supported the 8 children he had with several different women over the years. Burke drove a gold Mercedes-Benz and wore a large diamond ring. He made numerous large investments and was not shy about sharing his large returns on them. His father reported that his son once had $400,000 in cash on him from one such investment. He maintained that his son's wealth, despite his modest airline salary of between $24,000 and $31,000 a year over the course of his career, was generated by his wise business decisions and side businesses, doing landscaping and snow removal. Burke was the apple of his father's eye and respected in his community for helping Jamaican immigrants find jobs. However, his personality was not always as positive as his public persona implied. Burke was very polite and calm in public, but could also come across as calculating. While he generally held fierce control over his emotions, those strong feelings eventually erupted in dark moods and violent emotional outbursts. The control Burke held over his life, and what allegedly was the true source of his financial stability, was lost in 1985, when he was investigated by the Rochester Narcotics Unit as part of a drug smuggling investigation. Starting that January, more than 50 people were arrested, and several of them were ultimately convicted in court. The operation involved trafficking hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of marijuana and cocaine from Jamaica to the United States through the Rochester airport. Investigators initially became interested in Burke after his name came up on a confidential wiretap. Police informants also reported that Burke was using his connections at the airport to ensure the safe passage of the drugs through security. Burke was never the primary target of the investigation, but it was believed that he was a major link in the smuggling operation. He was investigated a total of 3 times by the FBI and police in Rochester for potentially being involved in drug smuggling between 1984 and 1985. He was also investigated by the FBI for potentially being part of a car theft ring. However, according to the FBI, there was never enough evidence to arrest and charge Burke in any case. One of Burke's friends later did confirm to the Rochester Times-Tribune that Burke was involved in selling cocaine, and in large quantities. Burke's brother Joseph had died of an accidental overdose in 1980, and he had been the person who discovered his body. Burke had tried to help his brother for some time, and therefore felt responsible for Joseph's death. He was very stoic about Joseph's death at first, and expressed none of his emotions about it for weeks, until he one day erupted into a fit of sobs, according to one of his former girlfriends. Burke therefore did not use drugs himself, but he enjoyed how lucrative the business was. His friend alleged that Burke once told him, "Dope is for dopes, and I make money off them." Burke quit selling drugs in the wake of the FBI investigation. He believed that his phone had been tapped, and he was offended that he was being investigated. The investigation also affected his day job, as police had once taken him away from work in handcuffs to bring him in for questioning, and he believed it was the reason he did not get a promotion he had been expecting at the time. There were also allegations that Burke used his position at US Air to steal cash from customers through ticketing scams and overcharging baggage fees, but he was never formally charged with wrongdoing by the company. Burke did feel like he was under undue scrutiny at work, and he was being monitored by police, given that they had found potential connections between him and numerous criminal enterprises. The professional or legal scrutiny, or a combination of the two, may have been the reason he eventually left Rochester. He told friends that he felt as though he could move up through the ranks at US Air faster if he got away from all the problems he was having in Rochester. He took a pay cut and a demotion in order to facilitate a transfer to a position at Los Angeles International Airport. In December of 1986, Burke moved from Rochester to Long Beach, California, after throwing himself a large going-away party at a local nightclub. He would make frequent trips back to Rochester over the following year to see his family. He always presented his decision to move to California as one he made to simply better his life, not because he was avoiding legal and professional problems, and acted as though he was flourishing out on the West Coast. However, Burke was not doing as well in California as he would have liked his relatives and friends back in Rochester to believe. On July 5, 1987, 6 months after he transferred to LAX, he went to the Department of Fair Employment in Los Angeles, alleging that he had been discriminated against based on his race. He had twice been passed over for available customer service supervisor positions, with one of them going to a white woman he did not feel was as qualified as he was. Burke never came back to the department to formally level a complaint against U.S. Air. Then, Burke's 15-year career with U.S. Air came to an abrupt end on November 15, 1987. Burke was seen on a hidden security camera, stealing $69 in cash from the proceeds of in-flight cocktail sales, and arrested by U.S. Air security officers. 4 days later, Burke was formally terminated from the company. In spite of the video evidence, Burke's father would later argue that his son would not have stolen the $69 because he had lots of money and didn't need to steal such a small amount. However, the one criminal charge that his son had not been able to avoid was also for stealing something of very little value. In 1984, while he was still living in Rochester, Burke had been arrested for stealing $45 worth of items from a local store. He had been charged with petty larceny, but was able to plead the charge down to disorderly conduct. U.S. Air did not immediately pursue misdemeanor theft charges against Burke. Burke believed that this meant he could get his job back. He appealed his termination and was given a date for a grievance hearing. He told his friends and family that he had simply been unfairly suspended and would return to work soon. He appeared very confident that he would be reinstated following his grievance hearing. The hearing was scheduled for December 7, 1987, just 2 hours before Flight 1771 would crash. Burke's alleged criminal activity at the time was not limited to his workplace, however. Around the time he was fired, his ex-girlfriend was awarded a temporary restraining order against him. On October 16, 1987, he dragged her from her bed by the throat and tried to choke her to death. Over the following few days, he would cut the brake line in her car, steal important items from the car, and cut up items of her clothing. He admitted to her that he had done all of these things. Burke did not stay away from her, however. On December 4th, she arrived home with her 6-year-old daughter around 1 a.m. Burke accosted them in their apartment building's parking structure with a pistol and forced her and her daughter back into the car. He drove them around for some time before bringing them back to their apartment, where he continued harassing them for several hours before finally leaving at 7 a.m. She filed a report with police so that they would be aware of the incident, but chose not to press charges against Burke. Burke's grievance hearing was at 2 p.m. on December 7, 1987. It was with 48-year-old Ray Thompson, the LAX station manager for U.S. Air. Ray had grown up on a ranch in Texas and was a graduate of Texas Tech. He had previously worked for American Airlines, the airline where his wife still worked as a flight attendant. He had left the company when he was told he would have to relocate to continue moving up in the company. He did not want to leave his home in Marin County, California, north of San Francisco, so he left American Airlines to work in the public sector for several years before he went to work for U.S. Air. According to coworkers, Ray was blunt and somewhat gruff as a person, but very fair as a boss. Ray took 6 pages of detailed notes during the half-hour-long meeting, so we have a record of what transpired. Burke told Ray that he wanted his job back as well as help with getting counseling for drug and alcohol abuse. He said he would drop the discrimination grievance he had begun filing with the Department of Fair Employment in exchange for U.S. Air not pressing theft charges against him. Ray told Burke that he would not be getting his job back. He would inquire about getting Burke help with counseling, but his termination stood. Both men left the office a few minutes after the meeting officially ended. According to Ray's secretary, her boss was red-faced and looked upset. David Burke, on the other hand, looked very confident, almost arrogant. It appears that, despite how confident he claimed to be that he would get his job back, Burke had already made plans to exact revenge against Ray Thompson should he not be reinstated. Shortly after he was initially fired, Burke flew to San Francisco to borrow the gun that would later be found in the wreckage of Flight 1771 from his friend and co-worker Joseph Drabeck. Burke told him that he needed the weapon for protection, while he was carrying large amounts of cash from some real estate transactions. He flew home with the weapon. After the crash of Flight 1771, there were serious questions about how a firearm could have been brought on board a commercial flight. Half an hour before his meeting with Ray, Burke went through airport security. At the time, airline employees were allowed to bypass security screenings and the metal detectors. Since Burke was out of uniform, he was required to show his work identification badge to go through the bypass point. Immediately after Burke was identified as the potential gunman, U.S. Air insisted that all of Burke's credentials had been seized and destroyed when he was first fired. However, one of his badges, complete with a photo, was located at the crash site. He still had a duplicate or out-of-date badge on the day of the crash. The employee at the security bypass point did not closely examine Burke's ID or check his belongings herself, as she was supposed to. Burke was a familiar face to her, so he just flashed his badge, and she allowed him through, unchecked. It is believed that Burke may have stowed the gun in an airport locker at this point. By 2 p.m., he was back outside the secure section of the airport. He had his grievance hearing, and then went to the PSA ticketing counter to buy a ticket for Flight 1771, before bypassing security for a second time that day. Ray Thompson, like many airline employees, made his daily commute at the airport. He was known to take the hour-long Flight 1771 every day as he was going home from work. Another piece of evidence found at the crash site seemed to confirm that David Burke had shot and killed several people on board the flight with a gun and killed the remaining passengers by causing the plane to crash in order to exact revenge on his former boss, Ray Thompson. Amongst the thousands of pieces of paper blown away from the impact crater, investigators found an air sickness bag with an unsigned note in Burke's handwriting. It read, "Hi Ray, I think it's sort of ironical that we ended up like this. I asked for some leniency for my family, remember? Well, I got none, and you'll get none." On the cockpit voice recorder, the sound of the door to the lavatory just behind the cockpit being opened and closed as someone entered and then exited it a short time later can be heard just before the first shots were fired. There is no way to know for sure, but it has been hypothesized that Burke handed Ray the note on his way up to the lavatory. While he was in the lavatory, Burke either loaded his gun or just waited so that Ray had time to read the note. We do know that Burke was sitting several rows behind Ray, and, thanks to a recovered seat cushion with 2 bullet holes through it, that he stood in front of Ray when he shot him twice, aiming for center mass. While Ray was the primary target of Burke's plot, he may have had the most merciful death out of everyone on the plane, as he did not have to experience the final terrifying moments of the flight, as all of the other passengers did. The next 3 shots killed, or at least incapacitated, one of the flight attendants, and the 2 pilots. The final shot is somewhat controversial. The most obvious explanation for it is that Burke killed himself. However, experts do not believe that this is the case. In order for the portion of Burke's finger to have been found in the gun as it had been, he would have needed to still be gripping the gun at the moment the plane crashed. Had he shot himself, the gun would have fallen out of his hand. The most common theory is that Burke shot Douglas Arthur, the chief pilot for Pacific Southwest Airlines. Douglas was off duty and just happened to be a passenger on the flight. He may have tried to run into the cockpit to attempt to regain control of the airplane and save it from crashing. Burke may have killed him so that he could not interfere with the final part of his horrifying plan. The FBI and the NTSB came to the same conclusion, that PSA Flight 1771 was brought down intentionally due to the actions of David Burke. Had he not been killed as part of his deranged exercise in revenge, he would have faced numerous federal charges. Several federal laws were passed in response to the crash of Flight 1771, one of which requires that an airline employee's credentials are seized immediately upon their departure from their job, whether by termination, retirement, or resignation. Airline employees can also no longer bypass security and are subject to the same security screenings as passengers. The crash of Flight 1771 also led to changes in the private sector. James Silla, the president of Chevron USA, was killed in the crash, along with 3 high-ranking public affairs executives for the company. 3 executives for Pacific Bell also died in the crash. Flight 1771 was a major factor in the expansion of corporate policies, prohibiting multiple executives from traveling together. Several passengers and crew members from Flight 1771 are buried in Los Osos Valley Memorial Park. In the cemetery's Garden of Hope, a granite and bronze plaque memorializes all 42 victims of the flight.